Everyone saw her as just another exhausted mom in seat 12F, managing crying kids and diaper bags. But when both pilots collapsed and the plane started falling from the sky, an F-22 fighter jet arrived. The military commander's radio message shocked the entire cabin: "Welcome back, Viper 1." Everything changed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Sarah Mitchell settled into seat 12F with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before, though now the choreography involved diaper bags instead of flight bags, juice boxes instead of mission briefs, and a constant mental calculation of nap schedules rather than fuel consumption rates. Her 5-year-old daughter Emma pressed against the window, nose already leaving smudges on the plastic as she watched the ground crew loading luggage, while 3-year-old Jake squirmed in the middle seat, his small hands already reaching for the tray table latch that Sarah knew from experience would occupy his attention for approximately 47 seconds before he moved on to the next source of entertainment or potential disaster. The flight attendant passing by offered Sarah a sympathetic smile, the kind that said she recognized the exhaustion etched into every line of Sarah's face, the slight slump in her shoulders, the way her eyes carried that perpetual tiredness that comes from years of solo parenting without backup, without relief, without a moment to simply be anything other than mom. Sarah returned the smile with the practiced warmth she had cultivated, the expression that said yes, she was managing, yes, she had everything under control, yes, this was her whole world now, this constant juggling act of snacks and entertainment and bathroom breaks and the desperate hope that both children would sleep for at least part of the 4-hour flight from San Diego to Seattle. Her yoga pants and oversized sweater told the story everyone expected to see, the uniform of modern motherhood paired with hair pulled back in a messy bun that was practical rather than stylish, minimal makeup that had been applied in rushed moments between breakfast and the frantic drive to the airport. The diaper bag stuffed beneath the seat in front of her overflowed with the essential supplies of her current mission: wet wipes, graham crackers, coloring books, backup clothes for inevitable spills, and the iPad loaded with enough episodes of children's shows to hopefully buy her an hour of peace somewhere over Oregon. The businessman in 12E barely glanced at her as he settled into the aisle seat, his attention already absorbed by his laptop and the spreadsheets that apparently couldn't wait until after landing. Sarah caught his slight grimace when Jake kicked the back of the seat in front of him, and she quickly placed a restraining hand on her son's leg, murmuring the gentle correction that she knew would need repeating approximately 17 more times before they reached cruising altitude. The businessman's relieved expression said everything about his expectations for this flight, trapped beside what he clearly viewed as just another harried single mom whose children would inevitably disrupt his productivity with their noise and needs and complete inability to understand that other people existed in the world. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve, her voice carrying that particular pitch that somehow managed to be simultaneously whisper and shout. "Mommy, when does the plane go up? Can I have my snack now? Why is that man putting suitcases in the bottom? Will we see clouds? Can I have my iPad?" The questions tumbled out in the endless cascade that Sarah had learned to navigate, answering some, deflecting others, promising treats and entertainment at strategically calculated intervals designed to maximize peace and minimize meltdowns. The woman across the aisle in 12D leaned over with a warm smile, her own children presumably grown and her parenting years now softened by time into nostalgic memory rather than exhausting reality. "Traveling alone with 2? You're a brave soul. I remember those days. How old are they?" The question opened the floodgates of socially mandated conversation, the small talk that Sarah had become expert at navigating, discussing ages and schools and the challenges of single parenthood while revealing absolutely nothing of substance, nothing real, nothing that touched the carefully buried core of who she used to be. Sarah responded with the practiced ease of someone who had told this story countless times, mentioning Emma's upcoming kindergarten year, Jake's obsession with dinosaurs, the challenges of coordinating work schedules and daycare pickups and the endless logistical puzzle of maintaining any semblance of normalcy as a solo parent. She mentioned her job in generic terms, something about consulting work that allowed flexible hours, and the woman nodded with understanding sympathy, clearly imagining some kind of remote administrative position that accommodated the demands of motherhood, never suspecting that Sarah's actual work involved contract analysis for defense contractors, Reviewing specifications for avionics systems and tactical communications equipment, translating her intimate knowledge of military aviation into technical assessments while carefully maintaining enough distance from her former life that no one would ask questions she couldn't answer. The flight attendant returned, conducting the standard safety demonstration that Sarah could have performed herself, having sat through this presentation in hundreds of cockpits from a very different perspective, knowing every word, every gesture, every carefully choreographed movement designed to convey critical information to passengers who rarely paid attention. Emma watched with rapt fascination while Jake discovered the entertainment potential of the seatbelt buckle, clicking it open and closed with mechanical repetition that threatened to become the soundtrack for boarding. Sarah gently redirected his hands toward a small toy dinosaur, buying herself perhaps 3 minutes of relative peace. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Sarah felt the familiar rumble of the tug moving them, the slight backward motion that signaled the beginning of every journey. Emma squealed with delight, Jake bounced in his seat, and the businessman beside her sighed with resignation at the 4 hours ahead. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, professional and calm, announcing their departure, estimating flight time, mentioning some weather over the Cascades that might cause light turbulence but nothing to worry about. Sarah listened with the ear of someone who understood every nuance, every underlying meaning, recognizing in the pilot's tone the confidence of routine, the comfortable certainty of someone flying a route they had flown 1,000 times before. The taxi to the runway consumed 15 minutes, enough time for Sarah to negotiate the distribution of snacks, confirm that both children had their stuffed animals, and promise iPad time once they reached cruising altitude. The aircraft paused at the runway threshold, engines spooling up to that particular pitch that Sarah knew meant takeoff power, and then they were rolling, accelerating, the nose lifting as the pilot rotated right on schedule. Emma pressed against the window watching the ground fall away while Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, his small fingers squeezing tight the way he always did during takeoff, seeking reassurance from the one constant in his young life. 30 minutes into the flight, with both children temporarily pacified by screens and snacks, Sarah allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to close her eyes, to exist for just a few seconds as something other than the sum total of her children's needs. The flight attendant came by with drinks, and Sarah ordered apple juice for Emma, milk for Jake, and coffee for herself, the first of what would probably be 3 cups before landing because exhaustion was her constant companion these days. The price of late nights reviewing technical specifications after the kids finally fell asleep and early mornings that began with the ruthless efficiency of small children who recognized no concept of weekends or sleeping in. The woman across the aisle caught her eye again, nodding toward the children with a knowing smile. Enjoy every moment. They grow up so fast. My youngest is 30 now, and I still remember when he was that age, how exhausting it was, but also how precious. You're doing great. Sarah returned the smile, accepting the encouragement even as something deep inside her chest tightened at the reminder of how completely her life had transformed, how thoroughly she had buried the person she used to be beneath the demands of single motherhood, how Viper 1 had become a ghost story she told herself late at night when the kids were asleep and the house was finally quiet and she could almost remember what it felt like to be that person, that pilot, that warrior. 45 minutes into the flight, cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet over Northern California, the first indication of trouble came as a subtle change in engine tone that probably 99% of passengers wouldn't notice but that made Sarah's head lift immediately, her attention sharpening despite years away from the cockpit. The businessman beside her continued typing, Emma and Jake remained absorbed in their screens, but Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on her armrest as she listened, cataloging, assessing, recognizing something wrong in the rhythm of the turbines. The pilot's voice returned to the intercom, still professional but now carrying an undertone that Sarah immediately identified as controlled concern. Folks, we're experiencing a minor mechanical issue with one of our engines. Nothing to be alarmed about, these aircraft are designed to fly perfectly well on one engine, but we're going to need to divert to Sacramento for a precautionary landing. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. The announcement generated murmurs throughout the cabin, nervous questions, the kind of low-level anxiety that came from passengers who understood something was wrong but had no context for evaluating the actual level of danger. Sarah remained calm, her training and experience automatically assessing the situation. Single-engine operation was indeed routine, nothing to panic about, and Sacramento was a reasonable diversion choice. Emma tugged on her sleeve, sensing the shift in mood around her. "Mommy, is the plane okay?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair with practiced reassurance. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. We're just going to land at a different airport. It's actually kind of exciting, like an adventure." Jake, still absorbed in his cartoon, remained blissfully unaware of any issue. But then the aircraft shuddered, a violent shake that sent drinks flying and caused gasps throughout the cabin, and Sarah's internal threat assessment escalated immediately. That wasn't normal turbulence or single-engine operation. That was structural, something critically wrong with the aircraft itself. The oxygen masks deployed with that distinctive pop and rush of air, yellow cups dangling on rubber hoses, and suddenly the cabin erupted into chaos as passengers scrambled to follow instructions they had ignored during the safety demonstration, pulling masks over their faces with varying degrees of success while children screamed and adults shouted questions that no one could answer. Sarah moved with automatic precision, securing Jake's mask first, then Emma's, confirming proper fit and airflow before donning her own, her hands steady despite the pandemonium around her, muscle memory from 1,000 emergency drills overriding any impulse toward panic. The businessman beside her fumbled with his mask, and Sarah reached over, adjusting the strap with quick efficiency before returning her attention to her children. Emma was crying now, scared by the masks and the screaming and the way the airplane was shaking, and Sarah pulled her close while maintaining her own mask, her voice muffled but firm. "Look at Mommy. We're okay. Just breathe normally. That's my girl." The pilot's voice returned, now stripped of its professional calm and replaced with urgent authority. "Brace positions, everyone brace for emergency landing." The flight attendants were shouting instructions, demonstrating brace positions, moving through the cabin with controlled urgency while the aircraft continued its violent descent. Through the window, Sarah could see they were far too low, far too fast, the ground rushing up with the kind of approach angle that no commercial pilot would ever intentionally choose, and her mind was already calculating vectors, speed, descent rate, recognizing that they were in a situation that exceeded normal commercial aviation training. The cabin pressure had dropped despite the oxygen masks, and Sarah could hear the distinct whistle of air escaping through what had to be a significant breach in the fuselage. The aircraft was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered, and she could see panels in the ceiling beginning to separate, the metal skin of the aircraft flexing beyond its design tolerances. This wasn't just engine failure. This was catastrophic structural damage, the kind of in-flight emergency that appeared in accident investigation reports, and suddenly Sarah's carefully maintained cover, her deliberate invisibility, became irrelevant against the overwhelming reality that everyone on this aircraft was about to die unless something changed. The co-pilot's voice cut through the chaos, transmitted cabin-wide but clearly meant for someone specific, crackling with barely controlled panic. "Is there anyone aboard with military aviation experience? We need help up here now. Captain is incapacitated, I'm losing hydraulics and I can't control this aircraft. If there's anyone with combat flight experience, we need you in the cockpit immediately." The announcement hung in the cabin like a grenade with the pin pulled, impossible to ignore, changing everything. Emma and Jake both looked at her, their small faces barely visible behind the oxygen masks, and Sarah saw the question forming in Emma's eyes because even at 5 years old, her daughter sensed something, recognized some shift in her mother's bearing, the way Sarah's spine straightened, her shoulders squared, her entire presence transforming from exhausted single mom into something else entirely. The businessman beside her was staring straight ahead, probably praying or processing his imminent mortality, and the woman across the aisle was crying while clutching a photograph, and no one was moving toward the cockpit, no one was answering the co-pilot's desperate plea because this was a commercial flight and the odds of having military combat aviation experience aboard were astronomical. Except they weren't. Not on this flight. Not in seat 12F. Sarah pulled her mask aside just long enough to speak to Emma, her voice carrying an edge that her daughter had never heard before, authority and command replacing the gentle patience of motherhood. "Emma, I need you to be very brave right now. You and Jake stay in your seats, keep your masks on, and do exactly what the flight attendant tells you. Mommy has to help fly the plane. Emma's eyes went wide, not understanding but recognizing that something fundamental had shifted, that the mom who made sandwiches and kissed scraped knees had somehow become someone different, someone powerful and sure. Sarah unbuckled and stood, moving toward the cockpit with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had walked flight decks 1,000 times before, her exhaustion falling away like a discarded coat, revealing the steel beneath the softness, the warrior beneath the mom. The flight attendant near the cockpit door tried to stop her, placing a restraining hand on Sarah's arm. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat and brace for landing." Sarah met the woman's eyes with an intensity that made her hand drop immediately. "I'm a fighter pilot. Open the door." The flight attendant hesitated for only a second before reaching for the cockpit door release, and Sarah pushed through into the controlled chaos of the flight deck where the co-pilot was fighting the controls with both hands while sweat poured down his face, his eyes wide with the knowledge that he was out of his depth and running out of altitude. The captain slumped unconscious in the left seat, blood trailing from a head wound where debris from the structural failure had struck him. The instrument panels were lit up like Christmas trees, warning lights and alarms creating a symphony of impending disaster, and through the windscreen Sarah could see the ground approaching at an angle that would turn this aircraft into a crater within 2 minutes unless someone did something impossible. The co-pilot's head whipped toward her, his voice cracking with stress. "Who are you?" Sarah was already moving forward, assessing the situation with the rapid-fire analysis of combat experience. "Former Navy fighter pilot. I can help. What's your status?" The co-pilot's relief was palpable even as he continued fighting the controls. "Lost number 2 engine completely, number 1 at 30%, hydraulics failing, most of my flight control surfaces are unresponsive or damaged. I've got maybe 20% control authority and we're dropping like a rock." Sarah's eyes scanned the instruments, her mind processing information with the speed of someone who had logged over 3,000 hours in high-performance tactical aircraft, someone who had landed jets on pitching carrier decks in night storms, someone who had brought damaged aircraft home against odds that would have killed lesser pilots. This wasn't an F/A-18 Super Hornet, wasn't the fighter she had flown for 12 years before walking away for her children, but the principles remained the same: energy management, controlled descent, using whatever control authority you had to achieve the least catastrophic outcome possible. She slid into the captain's seat, her hands finding the controls with muscle memory that transcended years away from cockpits, her feet automatically adjusting on the rudder pedals, her eyes reading instruments that spoke a language her body still understood fluently despite the long silence. "I have control," she said, the 3 words carrying the weight of naval aviation protocol, the formal transfer of responsibility from one pilot to another. The co-pilot released his death grip on the controls. "You have control. What do we do?" Sarah was already working, her hands moving across the panel with practiced efficiency, shutting down the failed engine completely, redirecting what little hydraulic pressure remained to the control surfaces that actually had some authority, adjusting trim to compensate for the massive drag from the damaged engine cowling that was hanging open like a broken jaw. "Get on the radio. Declare Mayday, tell them we need every emergency service Sacramento has, and notify them we're coming in heavy, fast, and with minimal control authority. Then get me the manual control override information for this aircraft type." The co-pilot keyed the radio with shaking hands. "Sacramento Tower, Trans-Pacific Flight 427 declaring Mayday, 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 multiple engine failure, structural damage, requesting emergency equipment and immediate vectors for straight-in approach." The tower's response was immediate and professional, providing heading adjustments, clearing all traffic from their path, mobilizing every emergency resource on the field. Sarah fought the controls, feeling the sluggish response of an aircraft that was barely staying aloft through a combination of forward momentum and sheer determination. They were at 14,000 feet and descending through 1,000 feet per minute, which gave her approximately 14 minutes to cover the 37 miles to Sacramento International. The mathematics were brutal but not impossible, assuming she could maintain enough control authority to prevent the aircraft from entering a spin or simply breaking apart under the structural stress of damaged components. A new voice cut through the radio frequency, crisp and precise with the distinctive tone of military communications. Trans-Pacific 427, this is Viper 71, U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptor. We've been scrambled to provide escort and assistance. We're off your left wing and assessing your damage. Sarah's head turned instinctively, and through the cockpit window she caught the distinctive angular silhouette of the Raptor, the most advanced air superiority fighter in the world, pacing them 100 yards off their wing with the effortless grace of a predator escorting wounded prey. The co-pilot was staring in shock, but Sarah's training had already catalogued the information. Military aircraft were scrambled for situations involving potential terrorism, hijacking, or scenarios where commercial aircraft posed threat to populated areas. The F-22's presence meant someone higher up the chain had assessed their crippled airliner as a potential hazard requiring monitoring and possibly interception if they deviated toward urban centers. The Air Force pilot's next words confirmed her assessment. 427, we have visual on your damage. Number 2 engine is completely separated and you've got significant structural damage to your right wing and fuselage. We're coordinating with Sacramento Tower for optimal approach. Can you confirm who's flying that aircraft? There was something in the pilot's tone, a question beneath the question, and Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling over her as she keyed the cockpit radio. Viper 71, this is 427. Aircraft is being flown by passenger with military aviation background. We're working the problem. Her response was deliberately vague, maintaining operational security even in crisis, years of training preventing her from volunteering classified information over unsecured channels. But the F-22 pilot wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. 427, understand military experienced pilot at controls. Can you provide further details on pilot qualifications? The question hung in the air, and Sarah knew they were running database checks, comparing flight manifests against military personnel records, trying to understand who was actually flying this dying aircraft. The co-pilot beside her was dividing his attention between his instruments and her face, clearly wondering who exactly had just taken control of his airplane. Sarah made the calculation in a fraction of a second. Operational security versus the need for full coordination in a crisis situation where lives depended on trust and information. Viper 71, former naval aviator, F/A-18 Super Hornet, carrier qualified, over 3,000 hours tactical flight time. She left out her name, left out her call sign, left out the parts of her identity that she had buried when she became a single mom in seat 12F. The radio crackled with a different voice now, older, carrying more authority, the distinctive command presence of someone who had earned respect through decades rather than years. 427, this is Colonel Mark Thompson, commander of the 144th Fighter Wing. We've identified your passenger list through FAA coordination with military databases. Stand by for confirmation. Sarah felt her chest tighten, understanding what was coming. The revelation she had hidden for 5 years while changing diapers and attending parent-teacher conferences and pretending to be just another mom whose only concern was whether the grocery store was out of chicken nuggets. The 15 seconds of silence felt eternal, filled with the scream of damaged aircraft and the beeping of warning systems and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Colonel Thompson's voice returned, and his words detonated like a bomb in the cockpit. 427, Military Personnel Database confirms. Welcome back, Viper 1. The co-pilot's head whipped toward her so fast she heard his neck crack, his mouth falling open as he processed what he had just heard. Viper 1 wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. It was the pilot who had logged more combat missions than anyone in her squadron, the aviator who had talked 3 different pilots through emergency landings when their aircraft were damaged beyond reasonable hope of recovery, the tactical genius who had rewritten sections of the fighter weapons school curriculum, the warrior who had been nominated for the Navy Cross after keeping a mortally damaged Super Hornet airborne long enough to save her wingman's life during a combat rescue operation. Viper 1 wasn't just a pilot. She was the pilot, the one younger aviator studied, the standard against which others were measured, the legend who had simply vanished from service 5 years ago when the Navy had accepted her resignation without explanation. Sarah keyed the radio, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack through. Viper 71, good to hear from you, Colonel. I'm going to need everything you've got on flight characteristics and emergency procedures for Boeing 737-800 aircraft with multiple engine failure and significant structural damage. And I need it in the next 12 minutes because that's all the time and altitude I have left. Colonel Thompson's response was immediate, his tone shifting from recognition to tactical coordination. Viper 1, we're pulling everything right now. My wingman is uploading technical data to Sacramento Tower for relay. What do you need from us for support? Sarah was already working through the approach in her mind, calculating angles and speeds and the diminishing control authority that threatened to turn this aircraft into an unguided missile. I need chase plane observation on my control surfaces. I can't see my right wing from here and I need real-time feedback on what's actually responding to my control inputs versus what's just creating drag. And I need updated wind information at Sacramento because I get exactly one chance to put this aircraft on the runway and I can't afford any surprises. She was fighting the controls constantly now, making tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft stable, feeling the edges of the flight envelope narrowing with every 1,000 feet of altitude they lost. The F-22 maneuvered smoothly to a position behind and slightly above them, the Raptor's superior performance allowing it to match their speed while maintaining observation position. Viper 1, I have visual on your right wing and tail surfaces. Your right aileron is almost completely gone, you've got maybe 20% of your right elevator, and your vertical stabilizer has significant damage but appears structurally intact. You're flying on trim tabs and rudder authority more than anything else. Sarah processed the information, her mind automatically adjusting her mental model of what control inputs would actually accomplish versus what she intended them to accomplish. Copy that, 7-1. Confirm my assessment, I'm looking at minimum approach speed around 140 knots to maintain control authority, which means I'm landing hot and heavy with limited braking effectiveness. The numbers were brutal. Normal approach speed for a 737 was closer to 130 knots, and those extra 10 knots translated to significantly more energy to dissipate during landing rollout, which meant longer stopping distance on a runway that wasn't infinite. Colonel Thompson's voice cut in with the updated wind information. Viper 1, Sacramento is reporting winds 270 at 8 knots, gusting to 15. They're proposing runway 28 right, which gives you 11,000 feet of landing distance and a slight headwind component. They're deploying barrier nets at the runway end as backup if you can't stop conventionally. Sarah ran the numbers in her head. 11,000 feet was generous under normal circumstances, but with their approach speed elevated by control limitations and their braking effectiveness compromised by structural damage, they would use every inch and possibly more. Copy runway 28 right. Tell them I want every emergency vehicle they have staged along the runway. This landing is going to be hot and I cannot guarantee aircraft integrity on touchdown. She glanced at the co-pilot, who was monitoring instruments with the wide-eyed intensity of someone watching a master class in combat aviation while simultaneously facing his own mortality. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of commanding aircraft and crews in situations that define crisis. "Michael. Michael Chen," he stammered. 8 years with Trans-Pacific, 4,000 hours, but nothing like this. Nothing even close to this. Sarah nodded, her hands never stopping their constant corrections on the controls. "Michael, I need you to focus. When we get to 500 feet above ground level, you're going to talk me through every instrument I'm not watching because I'll be flying entirely visual at that point. You call out airspeed, altitude, and descent rate every 5 seconds. If anything goes red that I'm not already aware of, you tell me immediately. Can you do that?" Michael swallowed hard but his voice steadied. "Yes, ma'am. I can do that." Sarah almost smiled at the automatic military courtesy that her presence had triggered. "And Michael? After we land, assuming we survive, you need to get every passenger off this aircraft as fast as possible. I don't know how much structural integrity we'll have remaining, but I want everyone clear within 60 seconds of wheels stop. Coordinate with your flight attendants now." Michael keyed the cabin intercom, his voice projecting a calm he clearly didn't feel, instructing the flight attendants to prepare for emergency evacuation, reviewing procedures, confirming everyone understood their roles. Sarah heard it all peripherally while her primary attention remained on the feel of the aircraft, the subtle feedback through the controls that told her more than instruments could about how close they were to the edges of controllable flight. They were at 8,000 feet now, Sacramento International visible through the haze ahead, the runway a thin line stretching across the landscape like a promise of salvation that might be kept if she made no mistakes, if the aircraft held together, if 1,000 variables aligned in their favor. Colonel Thompson's voice provided steady updates, calling out their position, confirming emergency services deployment, maintaining the professional commentary that helped Sarah construct a mental picture of the situation beyond her windscreen. Viper 1, Sacramento Tower confirms foam deployment on runway, all emergency equipment staged, medical helicopters inbound. They're requesting your passenger count and souls on board. Sarah glanced at Michael, who checked his manifest with shaking hands. 143 passengers, 5 crew members, including both of us. 148 souls on board. Sarah transmitted the number, her mind adding the faces of Emma and Jake to that count, her children sitting back in seat 12F wondering what had happened to their mother, why the exhausted woman who had boarded with them had disappeared and been replaced by someone speaking in calm military efficiency while their airplane fell from the sky. She pushed the thought away, compartmentalizing emotion the way combat pilots learn to do, focusing entirely on the technical problem of keeping this aircraft airborne until she could trade altitude for controlled contact with the runway. 5,000 feet. The airport was filling her windscreen now, the runway alignment looking good, her descent rate manageable but at the ragged edge of acceptable, the aircraft shuddering and groaning with every control input as damaged structures flexed beyond their design limits. Michael, start your callouts at 1,000 feet. Standard 5-second intervals, airspeed, altitude, descent rate. The F-22 remained in position off their wing, a technological guardian watching over their dying aircraft with sensors that could detect the smallest anomaly. Colonel Thompson's voice had taken on a different quality, the tone of someone who had flown combat missions with pilots who didn't return, who understood the weight of what Sarah was attempting. Viper 1, you're looking stable. Approach angle is good. You're doing great. 1,000 feet. Michael's voice began its steady cadence. 145 knots, 1,000 feet, 800 feet per minute descent. Sarah made a minute adjustment, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly, trading precision for stability because at this point stability mattered more than perfect alignment. 800 feet. 143 knots, 800 feet, 750 descent. The runway was rushing toward them now, emergency vehicles visible as tiny red dots along its length, foam covering the surface in patterns designed to give damaged landing gear maximum friction. 600 feet. Sarah could see individual features on the ground now, cars on the adjacent highway, people watching from the terminal windows, the fire trucks with their lights flashing. 140 knots, 600 feet, 700 descent. The numbers were holding, the aircraft staying on the ragged edge of controlled flight through constant tiny corrections that Sarah made without conscious thought, her hands and feet moving in the ancient dance of keeping an aircraft balanced against the forces trying to tear it apart. 400 feet. Emma and Jake filled her mind for one brief second, their small faces, their trust, the way they believed Mommy could fix anything because Mommy always had. She shoved the image away, focusing every particle of her attention on the runway threshold that was now less than a mile away. 142 knots, 400 feet, 650 descent. 200 feet. Sarah could see the runway numbers now, the threshold markings, the touchdown zone identifiers. 143 knots, 200 feet, 600 descent. She began her flare, pulling back gently on the controls, raising the nose to arrest their descent while maintaining enough speed for control authority, walking the tightrope between slamming into the runway and stalling 30 feet above it. 50 feet. The runway filled her entire field of vision, concrete and foam and the moment of truth. 140 knots, 50 feet, 400 descent. Sarah felt every damaged system in the aircraft, felt the structural limit straining, felt the crosswind trying to push them offline, and she corrected with rudder and aileron inputs that were more suggestion than command, asking the aircraft to do something it barely could. 20 feet. 138 knots, 20 feet, 200 descent. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a shriek of tortured metal, the right main collapsing immediately and sending the aircraft sliding right as Sarah fought to keep the nose straight with every bit of rudder authority that remained. The nose gear came down hard, too hard, and Sarah felt the structure flex dangerously as the aircraft began its uncontrolled slide down the runway at 140 miles per hour with only friction and luck between them and disaster. She stood on the left brake, using asymmetric braking to counter the rightward slide, and the aircraft groaned in protest as it skidded through the foam leaving a trail of sparks and debris. The deployed engine cowling finally separated completely, tumbling away in a shower of metal fragments, and suddenly they had slightly more directional control. Sarah worked the brake and rudder in concert, bleeding off speed through sheer force of will and technical expertise, keeping the aircraft from spinning or flipping despite the horrific damage to the right side landing gear and wing. 80 knots, still sliding, still fighting, emergency vehicles pacing them along the runway edge with lights blazing. 60 knots, the aircraft beginning to respond to inputs now that speed was dropping, Sarah able to steer slightly rather than just manage chaos. 40 knots. The end of the runway approaching too fast, but their momentum finally bleeding away into the foam and friction and damaged brakes that were giving everything they had. 20 knots. The aircraft shuddered to a stop 700 feet from the runway's end, tilted heavily right with its collapsed gear, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks, smoke pouring from the overheated brakes, but stopped, intact enough to protect its occupants, close enough to success that Sarah allowed herself one full breath before training took over again and she was moving, shutting down the remaining systems, deploying the evacuation slides, keying the cabin intercom. Evacuate. Evacuate. Leave everything and get out now. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded in combat, and through the cockpit door she heard the flight attendants taking up the call, heard the slides deploying with their distinctive hiss, heard the first passengers beginning to move. Michael was staring at her with something approaching awe. Holy hell! You just landed an unflyable aircraft. Sarah was already out of her seat, moving toward the cabin with one thought overwhelming everything else, her children. She pushed through the cockpit door into the chaos of evacuation, passengers scrambling over seats toward the exits, the flight attendants directing traffic with practiced efficiency despite their own terror. And there in seat 12F, Emma and Jake were standing on their seats crying, reaching for her, and Sarah covered the distance at a run. She scooped Jake up with one arm, grabbed Emma's hand with the other, and moved toward the nearest exit with the speed of someone who knew exactly how fast aircraft fires could develop. The emergency slide loomed before them, bright yellow against the smoke beginning to fill the cabin, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She positioned Jake in her arms, wrapped Emma tight against her chest, and stepped into the slide's embrace, gravity and friction carrying them down to the concrete where emergency personnel were already directing evacuees away from the aircraft. Sarah ran, her children clutched against her, putting distance between them and the aircraft that had become a monument to structural damage and aviation crisis. 50 yards. 100. She finally stopped, turning back to watch as the last passengers tumbled down the slides, as the flight attendants came last after confirming an empty cabin, as foam trucks surrounded the aircraft spraying everything with flame-suppressant chemicals against fires that mercifully hadn't started but could at any moment. Emma was sobbing against her chest while Jake clung to her neck with the desperate strength of frightened 3-year-olds everywhere. Mommy, you flew the plane. You flew the plane and saved us. Emma's voice was muffled against Sarah's shoulder, comprehension dawning in the way children understand things that adults try to hide. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair with a shaking hand, adrenaline finally catching up with her now that the crisis had passed. A military staff car rolled up, and Colonel Mark Thompson climbed out, his flight suit marking him clearly as the F-22 commander who had provided support from above. He was older than Sarah expected, gray threading his hair, the kind of weathered competence that came from 30 years of military aviation. He approached with the slightly formal bearing of someone who understood he was meeting a legend, even if that legend was currently wearing yoga pants and holding 2 crying children. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. It's an honor. His salute was crisp despite the informal setting, and Sarah found herself automatically returning it even with Jake attached to her hip. Colonel. Thank you for the support up there. We couldn't have done it without Chase plane observation. Thompson's smile was genuine. Ma'am, with respect, you absolutely could have. That was the finest piece of flying I've seen in my entire career. You took an unflyable aircraft and made it fly through sheer skill and determination. Emma pulled back to look at her mother with wide eyes. Mommy was a lieutenant commander. Like in the Navy? Sarah met her daughter's gaze, seeing the questions forming, the reconstruction of identity that would need to happen, the explanation that couldn't be delayed any longer. Yes, baby. Mommy was in the Navy. I flew fighter jets before you were born. The businessman from seat 12E stumbled past them, covered in foam from the slide, and stopped dead when he saw Sarah holding her children while talking to the Air Force colonel. Recognition dawned slowly on his face, comprehension of who exactly had been sitting beside him, who he had mentally dismissed as just another harried single mom. That was you. You were flying. You saved all of us. His voice cracked with emotion and gratitude and shock. More passengers were approaching now, a growing crowd of people who had seen death approaching and been pulled back by the skill of someone they had never looked at twice, someone they had categorized and dismissed without understanding that sometimes the exhausted single mom in seat 12F is actually one of the most accomplished combat pilots of her generation. The woman from seat 12D pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face, and pulled Sarah into a careful embrace that accommodated the children still clinging to her. I asked you about parenting challenges. You were just being polite, weren't you? While carrying all of that inside you, while hiding who you really are. Sarah returned the embrace gently, understanding the woman's need to process the revelation. I'm still a mom. That wasn't hiding. That's who I am now. The other stuff, the military stuff, that's my past. Colonel Thompson cleared his throat gently. Ma'am, if I may. The Navy is going to want to talk to you. What you did today, getting that aircraft down intact with minimal injuries, that's going to make headlines. There will be questions about why one of their best pilots left service, why your tactical expertise wasn't being utilized, why you were sitting in seat 12F instead of training the next generation of aviators. Sarah looked at Emma and Jake, their small faces pressed against her, their world fundamentally shifted by the revelation of who their mother really was. I left because they needed me more than the Navy did. Because being their mom was more important than being Viper 1. Because some missions are more important than others, and raising good humans is the most important mission there is. Thompson nodded slowly, respect deepening in his eyes. I'm a father of 3 myself, ma'am. I understand. But I hope you also understand that what you did today demonstrated something important. You didn't stop being Viper 1 just because you became a mom. Both things can be true. Both things are true. The word settled over Sarah like recognition of something she had struggled with for 5 years, the binary choice she had constructed in her mind between warrior and mother, between the pilot who commanded respect and the single parent who commanded nothing more than bedtime routines and grocery lists. Emma was pulling at her sleeve again, her child's directness cutting through adult complexity. Mommy, are you going to fly planes again? Can we watch? Sarah laughed despite herself, the sound edged with exhaustion and emotion and relief that everyone had survived. I don't know, baby. Right now I'm just glad we're all safe. She turned back to Thompson. Colonel, I appreciate the recognition, but my life is different now. I have responsibilities that don't include tactical aviation. With respect, ma'am, today proved you can handle both. That you never stopped being capable of both. The Navy invested millions in your training, and the instincts that kept everyone aboard that aircraft alive are instincts that could save more lives, train more pilots, advance tactical doctrine in ways that matter. Thompson paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. I'm not recruiting you. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe the binary choice isn't as binary as you thought. The FAA investigators were arriving now, along with NTSB officials and airline executives and media crews being held back by security at the perimeter, and Sarah knew her carefully constructed invisibility had been comprehensively shattered. By tomorrow morning, her face would be on every news channel, her call sign trending on social media, her story dissected and analyzed and celebrated. The single mom who saved a plane. The legend who never stopped being a legend even when she was changing diapers in seat 12F. Michael Chen emerged from the crowd, having finally been released by paramedics who confirmed he was physically fine if emotionally traumatized. He approached Sarah with the hesitant reverence of someone approaching a celebrity. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you. And to say that if you ever want a reference for anything, anywhere, I'll spend the rest of my life telling people what you did today." His voice broke slightly. "You saved my life. You saved everyone." Sarah shifted Jake to her other hip, feeling the weight of gratitude that couldn't be adequately expressed, that didn't need to be. "You did great up there, Michael. You kept it together when it mattered most. That's all any of us can do." She glanced back at the aircraft, still surrounded by emergency vehicles, its damaged right wing clearly visible even from this distance, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of mission accomplished, objective achieved, bringing everyone home against odds that said otherwise. Emma tugged her sleeve again, insistent. "Mommy, everyone is looking at you." It was true. The crowd of evacuated passengers had formed a respectful semicircle, watching her, waiting for something, some acknowledgement or speech or moment of connection with the person who had stood between them and death. Sarah looked at their faces, seeing gratitude and shock and the beginning of comprehension that their lives had been saved by someone they had completely overlooked. She raised her voice slightly, addressing them all. "Everyone did exactly what they needed to do today. You listened to instructions, you evacuated efficiently, you took care of each other. That's what saved lives. Not just my flying, but your actions as passengers. You should all be proud." It was deflection, tactical redirection of credit away from herself toward the group, but it was also true. Panic could have killed them as surely as structural failure. The woman from 12D stepped forward again, her voice shaking but determined. "Don't minimize what you did. Don't hide behind humility. We all saw regular pilots up in that cockpit before things went wrong, and they couldn't handle it. You could. You did. And we're alive because someone with your skills happened to be sitting in seat 12F." The crowd murmured agreement, and Sarah felt the weight of recognition settling over her like a cloak she had deliberately shed 5 years ago. Colonel Thompson approached with his business card. "Viper 1, the tactical aviation community never forgot you. Whenever you're ready, there's a place for you, whatever form that takes." Sarah nodded, holding her children close, feeling the weight of two identities beginning to reconcile rather than conflict. She was a mom, exhausted and worried. But she was also Viper 1, combat aviator, the pilot who could bring dying aircraft home against impossible odds. Emma looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, you flew the airplane." Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, her voice gentle. "Yes, baby. Sometimes the most amazing people are the ones nobody notices." The moms sitting in seat 12F who just happened to be warriors too. The recognition had come. The call sign had been spoken. "Welcome back, Viper 1, had echoed across military radio frequencies and changed everything. And Sarah Mitchell, warrior and mother unified at last, walked toward the terminal with her children, ready for whatever came next.